She was mocked in the divorce, but when she revealed a shocking document, he realized his mistake. The room was cold, yet Helen felt an unbearable heat rising in her chest as she sat alone at the table, her fingers clenched tightly around the leather strap of her handbag. Across from her, Gregory leaned back in his chair, smirking with the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. His expensive suit seemed freshly tailored, and the smug gleam in his eyes made it clear he had rehearsed this moment. His lawyer, a flashy man in his 50s with a voice as oily as his gelled hair, whispered something in his ear, prompting a chuckle that echoed a bit too loudly through the courtroom. Helen sat in silence, watching them, her stomach twisting at how casually they discarded 22 years of marriage like an old piece of furniture. The judge entered, and the room stood still as everyone rose. Helen's heart pounded, but her expression remained unreadable. As they took their seats again, Gregory's lawyer wasted no time, beginning with a speech that painted Helen as a woman who had contributed nothing of value to the marriage. "She has no income, no education beyond community college," he said with a smirk, glancing at Helen as though daring her to refute it. "She's been dependent on Mr. Stone for 2 decades. Gregory barely concealed his satisfaction. Helen glanced down at the manila folder resting on her lap. Inside, she held the document no one seemed to remember. Yet, her silence wasn't weakness, it was timing. Long before courtrooms and lawyers, there had been laughter in Helen's life. She had met Gregory in college, both working part-time at a small bookstore nestled between a bakery and a laundromat. He had been charming then, a little shy even, offering to carry boxes for her, and making jokes that made her laugh on days when all she could afford for lunch was a peanut butter sandwich. They were both dreamers, both believing in a future where love and hard work would be enough. After graduation, Helen gave up her chance to pursue writing full-time, choosing instead to support Gregory through law school. She took jobs, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, always with the belief that their sacrifices were shared investments in a future they'd build together. They married in a modest ceremony, surrounded by friends who believed theirs was a fairy tale in the making. For a while, it was. Helen stayed home when their daughter, Megan, was born. She poured her energy into raising her and managing their household, trusting that Gregory appreciated the partnership. She never asked for more than what they agreed to. She kept the books, handled the bills, maintained the house. When Gregory's career took off, she was proud. He brought home promotions and nice clothes, and she brought order to their lives. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. She believed, deeply, that he respected her. But respect has a way of fading quietly when one side starts believing they deserve more than the other can offer. It was subtle at first, the shift in his tone. He began coming home later, brushing off dinner plans with excuses about meetings and client obligations. Helen told herself not to overthink it. Men in his field worked long hours. But soon the distance grew colder, the air heavier when he walked into the room. He stopped asking about her day, forgot anniversaries, and became irritated when she asked simple questions. "Why does it matter what I'm doing, Helen?" he once snapped, slamming his briefcase on the kitchen counter. That night, she sat on the back porch long after the dishes were done, staring at the quiet street, wondering where the man she loved had gone. Then came the lies. Small ones, at first, receipts in his jacket pocket from places he never mentioned, lipstick stains on his shirt collar that didn't belong to her, the sudden insistence that he needed his own space to think. When she confronted him, he was dismissive. "You're imagining things," he said with a look of pity, not guilt. Helen tried to believe him. She wanted to believe him. She told herself that stress made people behave strangely, that marriage had seasons. But inside, she felt a truth she couldn't yet prove. Her home no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like a glass house with cracks forming, and she was the only one who could see them spreading. The moment of confirmation came like a knife. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Helen accidentally answered Gregory's phone while he was in the shower. She had only meant to silence it. But the screen lit up with a message preview from someone named S. It read, "Last night was perfect. I wish I could wake up beside you every day." Her hands shook as she stared at it, and when Gregory emerged from the bathroom, she asked him directly, "Who is S?" For a brief second, he looked startled, caught. Then his face twisted into that same smug grin he would wear in court years later. "You went through my phone? That's a serious invasion of privacy," he said. "Not a denial. Not an apology." That night, Gregory packed his suitcase. He didn't ask if Helen was okay. He didn't even ask about Megan. "I'll have my lawyer send over the paperwork," he said, as if canceling a hotel reservation. Helen sat on the bed, stunned. The same bed they had shared for over 2 decades now felt like a stranger's. In the days that followed, her daughter, now in college, called constantly, torn between disbelief and anger. Helen couldn't explain it either. What do you say when the person who promised to protect you becomes the one tearing you down? Her world, once stable, had imploded without warning. And the man she had sacrificed everything for acted as if she were merely a phase he was finished with. The first letter from Gregory's attorney arrived within the week. A polished envelope with a tone so cold it could frost glass. It outlined everything he intended to claim: the house, the car, the savings account, even the summer cabin they had restored together with their bare hands. Helen was stunned. She hadn't even thought about money yet. She was still trying to understand how her life had unraveled so completely. But there it was, in black and white. He wasn't just leaving, he was erasing her. Her lawyer, a kind but weary man named Michael, read the documents with a tight jaw. "They're going to come at you hard," he warned. "They want to paint you as a dependent, unproductive spouse." Helen stared at the papers without blinking. Every line felt like another blow to the life she thought she had built with dignity and love. Gregory had moved into a downtown apartment and was living his new life openly with the woman from the text message. Photos appeared online, dinners, events, vacations. And here she was, standing in her empty kitchen, surrounded by memories that no longer belonged to her. But then, one evening while searching for tax records in an old filing cabinet, she found a folder. A document, signed by both of them, tucked inside the original property agreement. Her breath caught in her throat as she began to read it. The wording was clear. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was leverage. And maybe, just maybe, it was justice waiting to be claimed. The second hearing was more brutal than the first. Gregory's lawyer didn't just challenge Helen's financial dependency, he mocked it. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a case of a woman who chose comfort over contribution." Helen sat still, her back straight, but every word pierced her like a thorn. She felt the stares, the dismissive glances from the other side of the courtroom, and worst of all, Gregory's smirk as his attorney painted her as a burden who deserved nothing more than a handshake and an empty suitcase. The lawyer sneered, "She's been living in Mr. Stone's success. Now she wants to live in his pockets, too." Helen's cheeks burned, not with shame, but with something deeper, indignation. They spoke about her like she had spent 22 years lounging in silk pajamas, ignoring the sweat and worry that had filled her days raising their child, managing their home, supporting every one of Gregory's ambitions. She looked at the judge, hoping he would see through the performance, but he only scribbled something on his pad. Helen knew she had to endure it, for now. But she also knew something they didn't. Tucked inside her leather bag was the document no one remembered, signed in a moment Gregory thought meant nothing, and that she had kept all these years, not out of spite, but out of principle. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. The air in the house felt stale, and the ticking of the old clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. She went to the attic, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to breathe among the past. Dust danced in the thin moonlight seeping through the small window as she opened a worn-out box labeled Wills and Agreements. Inside were old tax files, renovation receipts, and a few faded photos of a younger version of herself, always smiling beside Gregory. And then, beneath them, a folder with a label in Gregory's handwriting, Premarital Contract, Private. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside was a copy of a contract Gregory had asked her to sign before they bought their second house. She remembered the moment. He had said it was just to satisfy a mortgage lender's requirement. She hadn't paid it much attention back then. But now, reading it again, something stood out. A clause. Small, almost hidden between paragraphs. It stated that in the event of infidelity resulting in a divorce, any jointly acquired property would revert in majority to the spouse who remained faithful. She read it again and again, barely blinking. A warmth spread through her chest, not of joy, but of resolve. She wasn't imagining her strength anymore. She was holding it. The next morning, Helen took the document to the only person she trusted with something this delicate, Mr. Thomason, a retired attorney who once worked with her father. His office, cluttered with legal volumes and aging leather chairs, smelled of tobacco and aged wood. Thomason adjusted his glasses as he read, then looked up at Helen, his eyes full of something between disbelief and admiration. "You've been sitting on a gold mine," he said. "Do you know what this is? This clause alone changes the entire dynamics of your case. Gregory never had this reviewed, did he?" Helen shook her head. "He brought it to me one evening, told me to sign quickly so we could move forward with the mortgage. I trusted him." Thomason leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Well, he didn't read the fine print either. And lucky for you, this was notarized and legally binding." He handed the papers back to her, his expression hardening. "Use this wisely, Helen. This isn't just paperwork. This is your truth, and it's time the court hears it." Helen left his office with the folder pressed against her chest, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to reclaim. The following days were a blur of careful planning and focused strategy. Helen met with Thomason again, and together, they mapped out how to introduce the document in court without tipping off Gregory's legal team too early. Thomason insisted on discretion. "Spring it during testimony," he advised. "It has to hit them like thunder, no warning, no time to recover." Helen, who had spent her life avoiding confrontation, now found herself practicing lines in front of a mirror, rehearsing her posture, her tone, even her pauses. Every part of her body was learning how to speak powerfully. She started walking differently, straighter, her voice steadier during phone calls. Gregory's lawyer continued sending letters with smug threats, still treating her like a ghost in her own story. They had no idea how much had changed. She even started reordering the house, removing photos, tossing out remnants of a man who had discarded her like an old coat. For the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar, calm. Not the absence of pain, but the knowledge that the storm she'd endured was preparing her for a different kind of confrontation. One where she would not be the one trembling. Court was set to resume in 2 weeks. Helen spent every day preparing. She went through emails, receipts, calendar entries, even utility bills, documenting everything that showed her role in their life together. Thomason connected her with a junior associate to help organize the files, a young woman named Naomi who reminded Helen of Megan. Naomi didn't just help, she listened. "You're doing something a lot of women only dream of," she said. "You're not just fighting for money. You're fighting for the version of yourself that was silenced." Helen smiled weakly, unsure if she believed it yet. But as the days passed, she found strength in the small victories, organizing timelines, uncovering old bank transactions showing she had covered the mortgage during Gregory's early career years, finding copies of the handwritten notes he once left her thanking her for being the glue. All of it would matter. All of it was evidence not of a dependent woman, but of a partner. As she filed the final documents into a labeled binder, she looked out the window at the early spring rain. This time, she would not be spoken over. This time, she was coming with more than words, she was coming with truth. On the morning of the hearing, Helen dressed with care. A navy blue suit, understated makeup, and her hair pulled into a simple chignon. She looked at herself in the mirror not to admire her appearance, but to recognize her resolve. As she entered the courtroom, eyes turned to her, not with pity as before, but with curiosity. Gregory, seated confidently beside his attorney, barely acknowledged her, only throwing a dismissive glance as if she were a minor inconvenience. His new girlfriend wasn't there this time. The court clerk called the room to order. The game was about to begin, but Helen no longer felt like a pawn. The judge entered, and pleasantries were exchanged. Gregory's lawyer began his argument once more, painting Helen as someone who had lived passively, contributing little while enjoying the fruits of Gregory's labor. "Your Honor, our client has been generous in his settlement offer. Ms. Stone refuses it out of entitlement, not fairness." Helen didn't flinch. Her folder sat in her lap, her fingers calmly resting on it. She watched as the lawyer gestured, embellished, and smiled. Gregory leaned back, confident again. But Helen wasn't listening to his version of the story. She was listening to her own heartbeat, steady, certain, ready. When it was Helen's turn to speak, Gregory's lawyer tried to preemptively discredit her. "She has no career history to demonstrate financial independence. No formal job. No professional accolades," he said smugly, walking in front of the judge's bench. "This isn't about punishing infidelity, it's about a clean break." Helen stood slowly, adjusting her papers. "Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge nodded. Her voice, clear and unwavering, filled the room. "I may not have earned a paycheck in this marriage, but I earned everything else: respect, responsibility, and the right to not be discarded." She presented documents, showing her unpaid labor in managing the household, handling finances, supporting Gregory during law school, and caring for their daughter during every illness, every school event, every night of anxiety while Gregory traveled. The lawyer interrupted, claiming it was anecdotal. "It's not anecdotal," Helen said, her voice rising slightly, "it's foundational. This marriage stood because I held it up. And he knows it." Gregory finally turned to look at her, his confidence beginning to falter. Helen was no longer the woman he walked away from. She was standing taller now, and everyone could see it. Gregory scoffed as Helen resumed her seat, but it was forced. He whispered something to his attorney, who looked momentarily puzzled. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Stone, do you have any further evidence you'd like the court to review?" Helen opened the leather folder slowly, lifting out the single page that had changed everything. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to submit this contract, signed by both parties, dated, and notarized." The judge received the document, glanced at it, and his expression shifted as he began reading. A hush fell over the room. Helen's eyes were locked on Gregory, who was now visibly tense. His lawyer asked to approach the bench but was waved off. The judge reread the clause, then looked at Helen. "Is this document authentic?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It's a private property agreement that includes a clause regarding infidelity and division of marital assets." The judge exhaled, turned to Gregory, and asked calmly, "Did you knowingly sign this document?" Gregory stammered. I don't recall that clause." Helen smiled, not smugly, not cruelly. Just with quiet certainty. She had waited for this moment, not to win, but to be heard. The judge handed the contract to Gregory's lawyer, who flipped through it in disbelief. He tried to argue ambiguity, but the language was crystal clear. In the event of proven infidelity, it read, "All jointly acquired property shall be awarded, in full or in majority, to the faithful spouse." Gregory's face turned pale. "She never mentioned this before," he whispered to his lawyer, who ignored him. Helen remained composed. She had spent nights reliving every word of that clause, memorizing it like scripture. Now, it spoke louder than any accusation she could have made. Gregory's attorney fumbled, trying to question its relevance. The judge raised a hand. "It is valid, legally binding, and directly related to this case." Helen then calmly presented phone records, hotel receipts, and printed messages, evidence that Gregory's affair had begun months before the separation. The judge took it all in silence. Then he looked directly at Gregory. "Do you deny this evidence?" Gregory said nothing. His arrogance had evaporated. The courtroom, once a place where Helen was belittled, now stood still in her presence. This wasn't revenge. This was reckoning. Gregory's silence was all the court needed. The judge reviewed the materials and announced a recess before issuing a ruling. As people stood and stretched, whispers filled the courtroom. The shift in energy was undeniable. Helen was no longer the humiliated ex-wife in the corner, she had become the woman who challenged the very foundation of how Gregory saw himself. Naomi came to her side, eyes wide with pride. "That was incredible," she whispered. Helen only nodded, her breath finally steady. She had spoken her truth, and it had landed like a stone in still water. Gregory sat motionless at his table, eyes unfocused. His lawyer stood a few feet away, already checking his phone. The once confident facade had cracked. Helen walked to the water fountain outside the courtroom, feeling lighter than she had in years. She knew the judge's ruling was still to come, but the real victory had already happened. She had reclaimed her narrative, not with shouting or vengeance, but with preparation, clarity, and something no one had expected her to have, power. When the courtroom reconvened, there was a notable shift in tone. The judge's expression was firm, his voice measured but unmistakably serious. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the private agreement signed by both parties and the documented proof of extramarital conduct, he began, "It is clear that the conditions of the clause have been met." The words hung heavy in the room. Gregory stared down at the table, motionless, while his lawyer's jaw clenched tightly. Helen sat still, hands folded, her breathing controlled, every fiber of her being focused on hearing every word the judge said. "The division of assets," the judge continued, "will reflect the stipulations in the agreement." A pause. "Mrs. Stone will retain ownership of the primary residence, the joint savings account, and 75% of all assets acquired during the marriage." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Gregory turned toward Helen then, not with anger, but with disbelief. As if the ground beneath him had vanished. For years, he had seen himself as the architect of their life. Now, he realized he had underestimated the very woman who had made it all possible. Gregory tried to protest. "This is outrageous," he blurted, standing suddenly. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Stone, sit down. You had ample opportunity to contest this before. The evidence is clear. The contract is valid, and your actions triggered its terms. This court stands by the agreement you signed." With those words, the courtroom seemed to breathe for the first time in hours. Helen's attorney nodded slightly toward her, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. But Helen didn't smile. This wasn't about triumph, it was about restoration. What had been taken from her was not just money. It was dignity. As the session ended, people began filing out slowly. A woman from the public benches whispered to her friend. She handled that with so much grace. Helen gathered her documents carefully, not hurriedly, as if every motion was deliberate. Gregory remained seated, staring ahead, stunned. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't react. Helen glanced back once before exiting. Not out of pity, out of closure. The man who had tried to erase her had just witnessed the full force of her truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. The reporters were already waiting outside. Helen hadn't expected that. Word had spread quickly about the contract, the courtroom reversal, the woman who turned a divorce into a quiet revolution. Flashes went off, and microphones reached toward her, but she kept walking. Naomi guided her down the steps. "Do you want to say something?" Helen stopped for a moment, turned to face the cameras, and nodded. "I won't talk about him," she said calmly. "But I'll say this, being silent isn't the same as being weak. Sometimes, silence is where we prepare our strength." She didn't wait for follow-up questions. With her documents clutched under her arm and her head high, Helen walked through the crowd like someone reclaiming forgotten space. As she reached the car, she allowed herself a long exhale. It wasn't just relief, it was release. For months, she had carried the weight of a story told incorrectly. Today, she had rewritten it, not with rage, but with conviction. And for the first time in years, her voice hadn't shaken once. Later that day, Helen returned home to find the house unnervingly still. The same walls that had once witnessed years of love, then disappointment, now echoed with a strange new peace. She sat in the kitchen, her fingers tracing the edges of a teacup. The ruling was official. The assets would be transferred within the next 60 days. The lawyer would handle the details, but the essence was simple. She was no longer bound to a man who had tried to erase her worth. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just felt present, fully and completely. She walked through each room, not out of nostalgia, but to reintroduce herself to the space. This was no longer the house where Gregory lived. This was no longer the house where she waited. This was her home now. And though there were memories in every corner, they no longer had power over her. She stood in the doorway of what used to be his office. A breath caught in her throat, but she didn't turn away. She stepped inside, opened the curtains, and let the light in. By the next morning, Helen's name was in headlines. Ex-wife turns the tables with forgotten clause, one article read. Another, woman silenced in divorce case stuns court with private agreement. Her phone rang constantly. Emails poured in, some from media outlets, others from women she had never met. Thank you, many of them wrote, for reminding us we have a voice. Helen sat at her kitchen table, reading them one by one. Not to indulge in praise, but to absorb the deeper truth, they weren't just talking about her. They were talking about themselves through her. An invitation came from a national talk show. She declined. A podcast wanted an exclusive interview. She declined again. Helen wasn't interested in fame. She didn't want her story repackaged as entertainment. She wanted her peace. Instead, she sent a short statement to the local paper: there is power in remembering who you are. And sometimes, remembering is all it takes to begin again. Then she closed her laptop, made herself a cup of tea, and sat near the window as rain began to fall, quiet, steady, and full of promise. The days that followed were strangely quiet. Without court dates or depositions, Helen found herself with time she hadn't had in months. Time to sit, to read, to breathe. The house no longer felt heavy with echoes of a man's footsteps or the hollow silence that once followed arguments. It felt hers, finally. She repainted the living room, not for decoration, but for renewal. The pale gray she chose brought light into the space, something she had lacked for far too long. Each brushstroke was more than color, it was a declaration that her story was moving forward. In the evenings, she would sit on the back porch with a cup of chamomile tea, wrapped in a sweater Megan had given her years ago. The world around her, once drowned in legal battles and uncertainty, was beginning to breathe again. Neighbors passed by and waved, some stopping to ask how she was doing. She kept her answers short but warm. There was comfort in not having to explain herself anymore. Her silence, once a symbol of suppression, had become her strength, and in that silence, she found peace. One morning, Helen stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom and truly saw herself, not as a wife or a shadow, but as a whole woman. Her reflection wasn't young, but it was strong. There were lines around her eyes, yes, but also a brightness that hadn't been there in years. She smiled softly at her own image, a smile not for anyone else's approval, but one born from recognition. She wasn't who she had been when Gregory left. And she wasn't who she was in that courtroom either. She had become something else, someone who had faced the worst and come through it taller. She began making small changes in her daily routine. She rejoined her old book club, picked up the gardening she had abandoned, and signed up for a community writing workshop. The idea of writing again, something she had buried after Megan's birth, stirred something in her chest. Words began forming again, stories, reflections, and truths that only now she felt brave enough to explore. She was building her life not from what was left, but from what had been waiting quietly within her all along. Gregory, meanwhile, was not faring well. News of the court decision had spread within his professional circles, and the once proud attorney found his reputation quietly unraveling. Clients who had once spoken his name with confidence now hesitated. Colleagues distanced themselves, not out of malice, but out of caution. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had lost everything, not just assets, but dignity, because he underestimated the woman he once married. His charm, once magnetic, now seemed rehearsed. His confidence, once unshakable, now felt brittle. The woman he had left Helen for had disappeared soon after the verdict. Whether out of shame or disinterest, she stopped returning his calls. Alone in his overpriced apartment, Gregory faced something he had never considered: accountability. There were no more distractions, no more battles to win. Only the echo of his own decisions and the truth that he had tried to bury. And worse than the financial loss was the realization that Helen, the woman he thought would never stand up to him, had risen in a way he could neither predict nor stop. Late one evening, Helen sat at her writing desk with a single sheet of paper in front of her. She hadn't planned it, but her hand began to move. The words came slowly at first, then poured out effortlessly. It was a letter to Gregory, not to reconcile, not to wound, but to release. She wrote of memories once sweet, of hopes they once shared, and of the slow unraveling of everything they had built. She wrote about betrayal, but not with anger. Instead, she spoke of disappointment, of the quiet grief that comes when someone you love chooses to become a stranger. She ended the letter with a sentence that surprised even her. "You taught me something, Gregory, not through love, but through your absence. You taught me that I was stronger than I knew." She folded the paper carefully and placed it in an envelope. But she never mailed it. Instead, she tucked it into the drawer where she kept old photographs and worn recipes. Not to forget, but to remember with clarity. Some messages are meant not to be delivered, but simply written, so that they no longer live inside us, waiting to be said. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, Helen walked into a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist's shop. She hadn't planned to go out, but the sound of the rain and the warmth of the cafe windows had drawn her in. The place smelled of cinnamon and espresso. She ordered a chai latte and found a seat near the back, by a window streaked with water. As she sipped her drink, she noticed a woman at the next table glancing at her. After a moment, the woman leaned over. "I'm sorry, are you Helen Stone?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. The woman smiled, not in awe, but in recognition. "I followed your story," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, it gave me courage. I'm in the middle of something similar." Helen looked at her, tired eyes, but determined. "Then you're already halfway there," she replied gently. The woman reached for her hand. "Thank you." They sat in quiet understanding, the kind only shared by those who have walked through fire and emerged changed. And for the first time, Helen realized that her story had already traveled far beyond the courtroom. It had found roots in others. It was nearly dusk when Helen heard the doorbell ring. She hadn't been expecting anyone and approached the door with casual curiosity. When she opened it, the last person she thought she'd see stood before her, Gregory. He looked older, thinner, with tired eyes and a posture that no longer commanded attention. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred the autumn leaves on the porch, filling the silence. Gregory cleared his throat. "I was in the neighborhood," he said awkwardly, though they both knew he wasn't. Helen stepped aside just slightly, not to invite him in, but to make clear that this visit would happen on her terms. He glanced at the familiar walls, at the garden she had revived, and the fresh paint on the siding. "You've done something with the place," he said quietly. Helen nodded but said nothing. They sat on the porch, two people who once shared everything, now separated by more than time. Gregory spoke first. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because I lost, but because I never really saw what I had." Helen looked at him for a long time. Her response was steady. "I don't need your apology. What I needed was your respect. And that came too late." There was no cruelty in her voice, just truth. A month later, Helen sat in the office of a local nonprofit, signing documents that would formalize the launch of something deeply personal, a scholarship fund for women navigating divorce or financial hardship. She had thought long about what to do with the settlement money. Buying things had no appeal. Instead, she wanted to invest in second chances, the kind that didn't come easily for most. The fund, named the Redefine Project, would offer small grants for education, relocation, legal support, or simply breathing room. It wasn't charity. It was empowerment. Helen worked with counselors, social workers, and advocates, forming partnerships with shelters and women's centers. Every time she read a new application, she saw echoes of herself, women who had been told they were too late, too weak, too dependent. And yet, there they were, asking for a chance. She read every letter, every story, and made calls herself to inform recipients. "This isn't the end of your story," she would say. "It's just a hard chapter." She wasn't just healing herself anymore. She was handing out keys to others who still stood behind locked doors. Helen never sought attention, but recognition came quietly nonetheless. Local media covered the fund's success, and community leaders invited her to speak at events. At first, she declined most of them, unsure if she had anything new to say. But eventually, she accepted one small gathering, a library hall event for women in transition. Her speech was simple. She told the truth. About losing her voice. About regaining it. About how silence isn't surrender, and how strength sometimes wears the face of patience. After she finished, a young woman approached her, holding a notebook filled with scribbles and ideas. "Your story made me want to write again," she said shyly. Helen smiled. "Then you must." These were the moments that mattered. Not applause, not awards, but the gentle shifting of someone else's path because her own had once felt impossible. She realized that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and often unseen. Just like the seeds she had planted in her garden, hidden for a season, then blooming when the time was right. Helen's mornings now began slowly. A walk in the garden, coffee on the porch, and the sound of birds replacing the hum of courtrooms and lawyers' phones. Her calendar no longer held deadlines, only things she chose: book readings, garden volunteer work, and weekend calls with Megan, who had started teaching at a university up north. Peace, she had learned, was not a destination, it was a rhythm. It was the ability to sit with oneself and not feel haunted. She looked at life with a new kind of gratitude, not for what had been easy, but for what she had survived. The divorce was no longer the center of her story. It was merely the catalyst. In its aftermath, she had built something stronger than her marriage had ever been, a sense of self that didn't shrink under pressure. Her home, once a symbol of abandonment, now echoed with quiet resilience. The garden thrived. And so did she. In her study, above a wooden shelf lined with journals and framed photos, Helen had hung a single item in a glass frame: the contract. The one everyone had dismissed. The one she had nearly forgotten herself. Below it, she had placed a handwritten note: "Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits in silence until it is called to speak." It wasn't pride that made her display it. It was remembrance. Not of victory, but of transformation. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and Helen would smile. "It's a piece of paper," she'd say. "But it reminded me of who I was when I almost forgot." The document didn't change everything. She did. It merely gave her the opening. What followed was hers alone: the courage to fight, the wisdom to walk away, and the grace to begin again. Helen no longer needed proof of her strength. She lived in it every day.